Various historians have attempted to tabulate the amount of time that human beings have been involved in war. And though the figures vary, based on what I have found reading different sources, it could be summarized that out of the last 4,000 years of recorded human history, less than 300 of those years have been times of complete peace around the planet. There have been something like 8,000 peace treaties signed during that time, and just about all of them were broken. And some historians have estimated that there have been as many as 14,351 separate wars in which an estimated 3.5 billion people have been killed. 3.5 billion people. Think about it. That is, at the moment, half of the current world's population. 3.5 billion. In the last 300 years, there have been 286 wars on the continent of Europe alone. I think it would be safe to say that one of humanity's hardest tasks is to establish and maintain peace. But many have tried, and many have failed. In fact, 74 years ago, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain became famous for his speech made after he returned from the Munich conference, where he followed the policy of appeasement toward Nazi Germany and gave in to their territorial claims. And on September 30th, 1983, Chamberlain spoke to a cheering crowd outside of his 10 Downing Street apartment, and he said, "My good friends, I believe it is peace in our time. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And I now recommend that you go home and sleep soundly in your beds." Peace in our time? Well, the words became a sad, bitter irony because in less than a year, because of Germany's invasion of Poland, Chamberlain was forced to announce to the British people that Great Britain and its allies were once again at war with Germany. So much for peace in our time. England and most of the rest of the world over the next several years, including the United States, were plunged into World War II, a second global conflict in less than 30 years. Peace for our times. Is that really possible? Our nation currently now is involved in a war, maybe two, depending on how you define it. Why is peace such a difficult thing to attain? And coming closer to home, peace is also something that we all wish for within our and around our own lives. We have strife in our neighborhoods, we have turmoil in our families, and we even have strife and turmoil within our own selves. And we wish that we could have peace for our own selves, but sometimes it's hard to come across. We can't seem to grasp it and keep it. And our Old Testament reading introduces us to a man who experienced a life of turmoil. You know, in our series that we've been going through the books of the Old Testament, we were in Genesis, and we spent several weeks in Exodus, and last week we looked at a story in Joshua. So the time has moved along several generations. The people last week we saw were poised, ready to go into the promised land. They took control of the land that God promised to them. But several generations have gone by, and now we're in the book of Judges, and there's a cycle in the book of Judges. It seems like there's this constant cycle where everything is good and nice, and then the people stray away from God's way, and God sends a judgment on them by sending some invader or oppressor. And then life is really difficult for them, and they realize their sin, they repent, and God sends a deliverer, and things are back to normal again. And sadly, then the cycle repeats itself again. That's kind of the plan of the book of Judges. And so Gideon is living in one of those situations where Israel had fallen away from God's plan. and some eastern marauders from what we now think of as Transjordan. The country of Jordan is on the east side of the Jordan River, and so some marauding tribes crossed the Jordan River into Israel and had taken control of the land. They were oppressing the people. They were stealing their crops and causing a famine, because whenever it was harvest time, these tribes would come in and take the crop. And there was nothing in the grain bins because these invaders were coming, taking all the harvest. And so the times was very difficult. So Gideon was living in this environment. And the story of Gideon opens in the setting when he was surprised by an angelic visit, when he was threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, right there is a clue for you. Why would someone be threshing wheat on a wine press? Well, the reason was it was not wine-producing time. It was wheat harvest time. But if he was harvesting wheat in the normal way, then it would have been obvious, and the marauders would have come and stolen the harvest. So he went to a place where no one would have thought to look, on the wine press. And plus he was doing it at night, hoping he could keep the harvest this time. So Gideon was doing this, and an angel appeared to him, and he was shocked by the greeting. Not just, an angelic visit, but also the greeting. As the angel said, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Well, Gideon argues back. "Oh yeah? Well, if the Lord is with us, then how come we're experiencing all of this difficulty, all these calamities? Why are there invaders in the land? And why are we starving when our crops are being stolen? How could you say that God is with us when we're suffering so?" Then God answered directly. It's not the angel anymore, it's God talking now, telling Gideon that he was to be the deliverer of Israel from their oppressors. God says to Gideon, "You are the answer to your own question." Well, how would you feel that happened to you? Well, Gideon said, no, not me. You've got the wrong guy. Look at what he says in verse 15. He said, "I'm not anybody special. And how can I save Israel?" So not only is my clan, Manasseh, one of the smallest ones, is insignificant clan, and I come from a small family. No one knows my father or anybody. And what's more is I'm not anyone important even in my family. You can't need me. I'm one of the most insignificant people there are in all of Israel. But God told Gideon, "You can do it. You can do it because I have enabled you to do it, and I will be with you." Well, not quite convinced, Gideon asked for a sign. So he was instructed to go bring an offering, and when God burned up the offering, well, then Gideon was finally convinced. And in fact, Gideon was now petrified because he realized that beyond a shadow of a doubt, he had been talking directly to God, the real God. And God assured him, though, that, "Oh, don't worry, all will be well. Peace be to you. Do not fear. You will not die." So Gideon worshiped God after this. And he built an altar, and he made an offering. And then he named the altar Jehovah-shalom. The Lord is peace. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at various stories in the Old Testament that teach us something about God. And in these stories, a compound name of God is revealed. And Jehovah, the proper name of God, is used along with some descriptive term. And so over the course of these weeks, this series, we've looked at the name of God as the mighty creator, our provider, our healer, and our banner. And we also looked at God as the one who makes us holy, and that God is jealous for us. And last week we looked at how God is the God of our ancestors and challenges us to continue in the work of faith. And so here we have another compound name of God in our reading in Judges is Jehovah-shalom, that is, the Lord is peace. Now, you might recall that we looked at the fact that the name of God can be rendered in many different ways. And the trouble is translating Hebrew into English. How do you exactly do that? And for the sake of consistency, you might remember I decided just to go with the form of Jehovah. But as you read through your pew Bibles, as you were reading along with Dick reading, you might have noticed that the word Jehovah is not in the text. You know, what Bible translators do is use the word Lord, L-O-R-D, with capital letters. And then the capital L is one font larger than the other letters. And this is done used in the place of the name of God. And translators do this out of respect for the Jewish custom of not speaking the name of God out loud. The name was considered to be so holy that you must not even speak it. And so they didn't use the word Jehovah. And so out of respect from that custom, translators have used the word Lord in capital letters. And so with the compound names, a characteristic of God is attached to God's name, so we learn something about God in the story, but you don't see the name Jehovah in the text. We see the word Lord. Now, if you were to look at a paraphrase, you would, like to say the Living Bible, you would see the name Jehovah there. So if you were to read the same passage, you would see Jehovah is peace instead of the Lord is peace, because it's a modern translation or paraphrase. So that's kind of something that you ought to notice. As you read through the Bible, you see the word Lord. That's a clue that the actual name of God is used. So here we have today, back to our subject, another characteristic of God, the fact that God is peace. Now this may be the first time, perhaps, that you actually know what the Hebrew word means. And we've been looking at all these different characteristics, looking at the names of God in Hebrew and words we weren't familiar with. And I'm guessing that before these messages you didn't know the Hebrew word Elohim and Jireh and Rapha, Nisi, Mekadeshkim, Kana, or Elohim, Abakim. Probably didn't know those words before we started out. But I'm guessing you probably did know what the word shalom meant before this morning. See, shalom has worked its way into our own language. Shalom is the Hebrew word for peace. But shalom is more rich than our English word peace. Shalom is a beautiful word, meaning so much more than just our English word peace. Meaning more than simply the absence of conflict. Shalom also means health and wholeness, well-being, security, and strength, and vitality. And over the centuries, shalom has been used in greetings and has worked its way into language that when individuals part, we might say shalom to this person as a way of giving a blessing and to wish them health and well-being until we see again. And so when Gideon heard God say peace or shalom be with you, he was hearing God say that things would go well with him. And when Gideon named the altar, God is peace, God is shalom, he was acknowledging that Jehovah is the source of shalom, the source of peace and health and well-being. Now, it could be argued, I suppose, that this name, Jehovah-shalom, is actually not a name of God. It's the name that Gideon gave to the altar. Not literally a name of God itself. But I think it's safe to say that since we so often learn something about God through the circumstances of our own lives, when things happen to us, we discover how God is faithful to us, that when Gideon and earlier, I think it was Moses, wasn't it, that named an altar after God, that when the name of the circumstances or the place can also be understood as a name for God as well. So this is important for us to understand, that the same God who Gideon called peace led him into battle. You know, when you think of this, kind of odd when you think about it, that God is called the God of peace, but yet God then led Gideon as a military conqueror and led him into battle. And yes, as we were talking about with the children, it wasn't your ordinary campaign. It was actually God intervening on the people's behalf. But still, this God of peace was leading someone into conflict. And if you think about it, you might wonder, why is Gideon using the characteristic of peace to describe God in this case? Not only was Gideon concerned for the fate of his people, who were being oppressed by foreign invaders, he was also troubled and fearful and doubtful because God told him that he was to be the leader of the deliverance. He was to be the people's deliverer. Well, that would have you shaking in your shoes, wouldn't it? But peace is appropriate in this case when we look at it in its wider meaning of shalom, because it speaks to a God who calms our fears, a God who helps us through our times of turmoil and trouble and blesses us with healing and wholeness of body, mind, and soul. So God is saying, I am the God of all of that, and Gideon is recognizing that he has someone on his side who is going to help him through all of the things he's facing. Though it is beyond our purposes today, we should summarize the end of the story of Gideon. I don't know about you, this is one of my favorite Old Testament childhood stories. You know, this curious thing about leading the soldiers to the water and all that, and breaking the pots. Well, right after this incident at the wine press, Gideon is motivated, and he uses some of the household servants, and he breaks down the altar, and he destroys the idol image. And people said, hey, what's going on? And so he says, yep, it's me, I did it. And at first people are saying, well, we need to feed him to the oppressors. But he spoke out boldly. He says, no, the Lord is going to deliver us. And so an army was gathered around, and Gideon led them. And God said, no, this was too many people. You have too many people, you're going to think that it's you that did the victory. So through a strange test of how they were drinking up the water, they reduced it just a few hundred people. And at night they surrounded the Midianite camp, and they made a bunch of noise at a key moment and broke the clay pots, and all the lights suddenly surprised them in their camp. And there was confusion in the camp, and they ended up fighting amongst themselves, and they sort of defeated themselves. The Israelites just kind of stood back and watched. God delivered them in an amazing way. So God defeated Israel's enemies and delivered them out of the oppression of Midian. And Israel enjoyed God's shalom for a time. And as we wrap up this story, we need to also ask ourselves, how can we experience God's peace? How does this apply to us? How does Jehovah-shalom impact our lives today? How can we achieve peace in our times? Well, first, we need to ask exactly what peace is. Ever thought about that? What is peace anyway? And this may seem like a strange, obvious question, but humanity often mistakes peace for the oppression of another group of people. You know, when I was in the military, we used to circulate the joke about peace through superior firepower, which isn't really all that funny at all, because history has proved over and over again that it's out of this oppressive situation where the next war springs out of. When you try to oppress a group of people, they're eventually going to rise up and rebel against you. So having the most guns is not the answer to peace. On the opposite extreme, though, sometimes we think of peace as some nirvana state, you know, some mindless serenity, linking it to inactivity, just kind of sitting back and doing nothing, and that's peace. Well, so we have these strange views of what it is. So how can we define this? Well, I heard an interesting story that years ago a wealthy man sought for the perfect picture of peace. Looked at all sorts of paintings and was not satisfied with what he saw, so he commissioned a contest and called for all artists that wanted to enter to paint a scene that depicted peace. And well, a lot of people answered the challenge. A lot of people submitted entries. And so at a certain point, the wealthy man had an exhibition where the paintings were going to be judged, and lots of people came to see what the entrance had produced. And then tension began to grow as the unveiling came off of each one, and everyone considered this lovely painting that was supposed to depict peace. But it seemed like, no, this is not the winner, and this is not it yet. And on they went until just 2 were left. And everyone's wondering, wow, what is this like? And so the unveiling came off of one of them, and everyone casted this beautiful picture that depicted a mirror smooth lake, green birch trees under a soft blush of evening sky, and on the grassy shore a flock of sheep grazed undisturbed. Surely this was the winner. This must be it, the people thought. But the last painting was unveiled by the man himself who had sponsored the contest, because the last one was actually his selection. So he pulled the cover off, and the people were shocked. Were surprised. They thought, how in the world could this depict peace, they thought. The painting, you see, showed a tumultuous waterfall, and as it cascaded down through a precipice, through a rocky crack, and the crowd could almost feel the cold of the penetrating spray of the waterfall, and in the background was a stormy gray clouds threatening to explode any moment in lightning and thunder and rain. In the midst of the thundering noise and the bitter chill was a spindly tree that clung to the rocks on the cliff. And there was a branch that stuck out, and in the cleft of the branch was a nest where a little bird had built her nest and was keeping watch over her eggs. And with her eyes closed and her wings around her little ones, she manifested peace that transcended all of the earthly turmoil around her. My friends, that's what true peace is. In this world, we will always be dealing with some kind of trouble, turmoil, conflict, tension, fear, trial, pain, and uncertainty. The list goes on. We will always be dealing with those kinds of things. But despite all of that, we can have peace with God despite whatever circumstances there are. Whatever we are dealing with, we can have true peace with God because God is with us when we trust in God's way. So our last questions we need to ask, how can we attain God's shalom? Well, first, we need to be right with God. In our scripture reading, Israel and Gideon was living apart from God's standard and worshiping worthless idols instead of worshiping the true God. When the people cried out to God and repented, God raised up a deliverer and brought them back to where they needed to be. And perhaps we don't feel God's peace because there's a sin issue in our life. Maybe we need to examine ourselves and repent of something and get right with God. How do we do that? Well, we do that through lots of means, but real quick, let me suggest the prayer at the end of Psalm 139, a wonderful little prayer of examination. Search me, O God, and know my heart, and try me, and see if there's any wrongful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. A wonderful little prayer of examination. Say, Lord, examine my life and see if I'm right with you. When we truly seek to live as God desires, we will be granted God's peace. And secondly, we need to accept God's strength. Gideon realized that he was not capable of being God's deliverer of God's people, and he was right. God soon showed Gideon that it wasn't going to be by Gideon's strength and ability. It wasn't going to happen that way anyway. So don't worry. God strengthened and enabled Gideon to do the things that God was calling him to do. And the same is true for us. I doubt that God will be calling any of us to command an army to evict invaders of Clay County or Owen County. But God is calling each of us to do certain things, to live a certain way. And because of our sinful world, we are not able to live by God's standard, but we can do it through God's strength. So perhaps God is calling you to do something special, mission, or through giving, or to reaching out, or to change the way you're doing things, whatever it might be. God might be calling you. And maybe you're resisting. You might be saying, Lord, I can't do that. I'm too old, or I'm too young, or I'm not skilled enough. I don't have enough resources. I don't have this. I don't have that. I'm not able. You have the wrong person. You must have it wrong, God. You can't need me. You need to find someone else to do that. But God is saying, no, I'm calling you, and I'm going to enable you to do it. When we trust in God, God provides, and God makes it possible for us to do what God calls us to do. Now, if we want to know and experience peace, we need to live in peace. And just like our gospel reading reminded us, we heard Jesus tell the disciples that they were going to experience hardship. It's going to be some tough times ahead. But don't worry. Jesus said, peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give you what the world gives. Good thing. I don't want what the world gives. Because the world gives us false peace and false security and a whole gob of turmoil and trouble. What we need is Jehovah-shalom, the God of peace, to grant us the peace that defies all worldly understanding. Thanks be to God. Amen.